Welcome to D Space Pride, a gay Star Trek podcast. Today, we have a special guest on the podcast who's going to be talking to us about mental health in Star Trek. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Johnson.
How are you doing today?
Other than wanting to either throw my computer, the microphone, or the whole internet out the window, I'm great.
Yeah, you're having quite a few technical issues today, it looks like. And you're not even on video, which is unusual.
Yes. I can't explain it. I do not know why my internet wants to act up.
God.
Yes. So it's very frustrating. But other than that, other than sweat, it's now become muggy. It was cooler earlier and now it's muggy. And we are recording this on a Monday evening, which is a really odd situation for us.
Yes. But there's a reason for that. It's because the entire Trekkies network is going to be in Vegas this week, other than us, because we're going to be in Boston for a wedding. And we need to get this episode out early this week. So there is a reason and a rationale for why we're recording on a Monday. So happy Monday.
Happy Monday. And also because we have a guest whose schedule this fit into. So
Yes. Speaking of, Dr. Sam, do you want to say hi?
Well, hello, everyone. And thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thanks for joining us. We're really glad to have you here, Dr. Sam. Mike, did you want to give a little bit of an overview of who our guest is and what he's doing here?
Sure. Dr. Samuel Kim is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Denver in Denver, Colorado. He has a bachelor's from Emory University and a PhD from Georgia State University. His interests lie in positive psychology, as well as fostering relationships among youth and their families. So that's really cool. He's a licensed psychologist in both Colorado and Texas. Do they license people in Texas? Really? And
well, that's not the focus of this episode.
No, it's not at all.
We do go on tangents once in a while, but
we do. Yeah. Interestingly enough, he's a child of immigrant parents from South Korea. And he also has a podcast, which is really cool, where he talks, it's called Research Sense for Korean American Therapy, where he talks about how he translates current research on Korean and Asian American families to practitioners. So welcome. Do you want to expand upon that a little bit more, Dr. Sam?
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed for the podcast was I would talk with counselors and other mental health professionals out there, and I realized that once they graduate from graduate school, they don't have access to research anymore. They don't have access to the research article. And it's like, wait, if you don't have access to the latest research, how can you make sure your practice is up to date? And so each one of the episodes for my podcast is just us talking about a different research article. So each one is a different article that we find that's based on Asian Americans or Korean Americans and about mental health.
Very cool. And he's a Star Trek fan, in case you haven't guessed. And also a member of the LGBTQ family. So it's really awesome to be here. And thank you, Johnson, for inviting him on our podcast.
Yeah. And then for the listeners who are like, who exactly is this guy? What is he doing here? Well, Dr. Sam and I met through the internet. And once we got talking, we both realized that we are both huge Star Trek fans. I had to kind of dig into what that meant. And once he told me that he has both the TNG and the DS9 technical manual, I was like, okay, all right, this is an acceptable threshold of fandom. And maybe it might be interesting to have him on the podcast not only to dive into his like and passion for Star Trek, but to also just get his perspective on mental health. And after we kind of noodled on a little bit, wanted to really delve into how mental health is portrayed in Star Trek, and like all good Star Trek, how it can apply to our lives today.
So, now that the chief's told you I'm smarter than the average bear, will you stop messing around with my holosuite?
If you turn the program back on.
What is it I'm not making clear to you, Charlie? You gotta go.
Don't you get it? I can't go out there.
Why not?
I'm scared, okay? I'm scared. When the war began, I wasn't happy or anything, but I was eager. I wanted to test myself. I wanted to prove I had what it took to be a soldier. And I saw a lot of combat. I saw a lot of people get hurt. I saw a lot of people die. But I didn't think anything was going to happen to me. And then suddenly, Dr. Bashir is telling me he has to cut my leg off. I couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it.
So we thought that it would be interesting for you, Dr. Sam, to just come on and just give us your perspective. So we are really excited to have you here.
Happy to do that. One of the things that I find really interesting is that I'm so surprised that neither of you have noticed my Sovereign class and Constitution class Enterprises on my bookshelf over here.
Oh, yeah. I've never noticed that before. I mean, I've seen it, but I haven't registered that. And you have all these other figurines too. And you have a Mario. I'm only really seeing it now. So that's amazing.
I'm pretty sure Super Mario Brothers is the reason that I grew up loving mushrooms, but that's a whole nother story too.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And looks like you have some Superman figures up there as well. So
I grew up loving
DC
Superman.
Universe fan.
But I love Marvel too. I'm not one of those people who is one camp or the other. But I did grow up loving Superman. One of the things about having a overpowered hero is that when someone writes a good story about Superman, it's a really good story. Like, you have a really good writer. And so I just really enjoy the stories in there. And then the themes of immigrants. I mean, Superman at the end of the day is an immigrant who comes to Earth and tries to figure out what it means to live in this world. And on top of that, he's living these American ideals as well as an immigrant, right? And he's accepted into that society. But this is a Star Trek podcast, right?
It is a Star Trek podcast. But sometimes, honestly, it turns into a weather podcast. We talk about the weather for like 10, 15 minutes. Last week, what did we talk about, Mike? I feel like it turned into like some other podcast.
Sleep. We talked about sleep. We talked about sleep last week.
Oh, yeah. We were talking about sleep. Like, we were talking about like how well we were sleeping. And that went on for probably 5 to 10 minutes. So then it was like a sleep podcast. It really does kind of run the gamut when it comes to the different topics to talk about. So, what you're talking about is nothing new to this particular podcast. We call it a Star Trek podcast, but honestly, it's probably an excuse for us to talk about everything else. So,
no, I'm loving this so far. It's a lot of fun.
So we, Mike and I definitely shoot the shit, and it goes in a lot of different directions. And I'm sure sometimes it's frustrating to our listeners, but you know what? I don't care. That's fine. They don't need to listen to us or like us. So that's okay. Cool. Well, Dr. Sam, just to start us off, we would love to know your first memory of Star Trek, and, what was it about it that really hooked you in? What was it about it that really made you a lifelong fan? And to add to that, how has it potentially influenced your journey in life and how you really look at life in general and your outlook?
Yeah, I would say that my first memories were I was one of those kids that grew up with a TV in my bedroom, for better or worse. And I remember that one of the shows I would watch in my room all the time was Star Trek, and it was reruns of Next Generation.
Yes.
And then slowly I discovered, oh, there's another Star Trek show called Star Trek Voyager. So I actually saw those episodes as they were coming out.
Okay. So did you not watch DS9 when it was live, or did you watch it after? Do you remember?
I think I was on the tail end of DS9 when I started watching Star Trek. And so I think I was missing out on the context of the story. So it was hard for me to jump in. I was like, I don't get what's going on. Why are these people? What's going on here? Whereas Voyager and TNG tend to be a little bit more of a standalone episodes. And then, of course, my parents just hated seeing aliens. They just thought it was disgusting. And so it was nice that I was watching it in my room.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, my mom would always watch me watch it, and she would be like, "Oh, what's that show with the bald guy?" Of course, talking about Patrick Stewart. That's how she would refer to Star Trek, and she didn't get it. So,
yeah, and also one of my earliest memories that I had of TNG was Deanna Troi, and I will say that I won't say something super cheesy like, "Oh, she inspired me to go into mental health," because I don't think she did, that character, but I think there is something about that character that contributed to me wanting to go into this field and being able to understand people. And I just want to inform our audience that I am not a beta Z, so I do not read emotions in other people. So don't worry about that.
Yeah. That's not something that I would have assumed a psychologist would have the ability to do so, though I would expect that some people would expect you to have that ability when they're talking to you.
Yes, we don't read minds. And if we do, somehow I've missed out on that.
Yeah. Cool. So, but eventually you did go back and watch DS9 at some point, and also catch up on everything else. Do you have a favorite series? Do you have a favorite episode?
I would say that my favorite series is probably Voyager, only because I was watching that as the episodes were coming out. Okay. And so I felt the excitement of seeing the previews for the next episode and having to wait a whole week to see that episode coming. I still remember the excitement of getting the previews for Endgame. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to be at home on Sunday night at 7:00. It's like, I gotta be there. God. It's like, Mom, I have to eat this really fast. Can we have dinner early? And all of that.
I think Voyager is my least favorite series. I'm okay with Voyager. After rewatching it 2 years ago, I found a new appreciation for it. Some of the characters were more complex than I remember. But I remember like when I was watching it, it was fine. I thought it was fine. I liked DS9 more, and I miss TNG. But yeah, now I have like a newfound appreciation for Voyager. And when Mike and I went to Star Trek Mission Chicago back in April, and Kate Mulgrew was there, I found a newfound respect. I got a newfound respect rather for Kate Mulgrew. She's really, really fascinating and engaging in person, and she's really funny and interesting. So I was like, wow, she's actually a really talented actress, writer, person. And that kind of helped me to also see Captain Janeway in a new lens. So, yeah, well, cool. Thanks.
Well, I'm glad you found a newfound appreciation of Voyager, because I was going to reassess our friendship.
Oh,
wow.
Well, you still need to watch Prodigy. Prodigy is such a good offshoot of Voyager. I promise.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll take a look.
And there's going to be more of that in season 2. Like more Voyager tie-ins.
Gotcha. So not only am I being told to watch something else, I'm also being given mild spoilers.
A little bit, but it's meant to be incentive.
Gotcha.
And just to say too, Voyager is not my go-to Star Trek, but on occasion I do watch it and enjoy it. So it's not even though it's not my go-to, it would still be something that I would watch if it were on, or if it if we were reviewing something.
And there are some really good episodides.
The Warp 10 episode where Janeway and Paris go to Warp 10 and Isn't that an amazing episode?
Yes, it's like the evergreen joke about Voyager. You just pretend that never happened.
Yes. Johnston, by the way, did you listen? Because you listened to the Delta Flyers, right?
Yeah.
Did you listen to that? What did they think about? Did you listen to the one where they reviewed that one with the Warp 10?
Oh, Threshold. Yeah. I mean, they similarly are just really they think it's terrible. Both Garrett Wang and Robert Durkham Neal think that it was a total joke. So the sentiment amongst the cast is also that it never happened. No, Janeway and Paris never had babies. It just didn't happen. So yeah, they have actually a very critical view of most of the episodes. They'll rate the episodes, and they usually on average give the majority of episodes a 5 or a 6. So that gives you a sense as to how critical they can be about their own work.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And then just as a side note, I have a friend who started watching Star Trek and getting into Star Trek about last year. And he has a doctoral degree in a biology field.
All right, we get it. Your friends are smart. Continue.
He watched that episode. I have never seen him so upset in my life.
Yeah, no,
just knowing his background and the science behind how evolution works and things, and he can't even talk about it. He won't talk about that episode with me.
Yeah, no, sometimes the science is a little dubious, but it's fine. It's fine. Well, cool. So yeah, Dr. Sam, we would just love to dive a little bit deeper into mental health as it is portrayed in Star Trek. And we'd just love to get some of your general views and your overall thoughts about how Star Trek does approach mental health. Like, is it good? Is it bad? Is it all over the place? Obviously, we talked a little about Deanna and her counseling technique. What is your sense about how mental health is viewed in Star Trek?
So I have a strong feeling that in this episode, I'm going to be very critical of the things that Deanna Troi and the other instances of counseling are in Star Trek. But I do want to start off by saying I strongly appreciate that Star Trek is willing to talk about mental health, that is willing to try to go into these uncharted waters in terms of mental health. And I think that's something to be lauded. I think that's something to be appreciated within Star Trek. It's like they're trying. And I want to give credit to that. It's like, you are trying. It's like, please continue to try. With that said, there are some things that kind of irk me the wrong way when I see certain episodes. So one of the first things that I notice about Deanna Troi on the ship, I was like, oh, it's so cool that she's doing these counseling things with different people and helping them out. And she gets to be a part of a lot of these meetings, even though most of the time it's pointing out the obvious, where she says, Captain, I'm sensing anger in this particular alien. I was like, no shit, the alien. Oh, am I allowed to curse?
Yes, I curse all the time.
It's like that alien screaming at you and threatening to attack you. I think he's angry. He's like, doesn't take a beta set to figure that out. But one of the things that kind of gets me is within psychology, we have certain ethical codes as well as laws that regulate how we do our work. And one of them is we're not allowed to have dual relationships. And what that means is if you are a client of mine, I can't have another relationship with you. So you can't be a family member. You can't be a friend. You can't be a coworker. Like, I kind of just have to have this one thing. The reason for that is if I know you in another context and I'm giving you therapy, there's always a risk something's going to leak out. There's always a risk that I'll say something and other people will find out about something that was told to me in confidence. Likewise, I will know things within the group that could come up even in therapy that may or may not be related. That's also breaking kind of a weird sort of confidence too. So it just muddles things up. With that in mind, I always wondered, how did they figure that out so that Deanna Troi can function on a starship? Granted, it's a big starship, but how could she function as a ship's counselor and maintain confidentiality in a singular relationship? Like, for instance, if she was going around doing counseling with, let's say, Picard, and knew about all the stuff going on with Picard, And then she was also doing counseling with a civilian who was really upset about certain decisions that seemed to be made on the starship and such. It's like she knows stuff. And instead of helping that client, she might be inclined to say, like, well, this is a decision that was made and we have to do it this way.
Right.
Instead of actually helping them through that.
Yeah, that definitely seems complicated because we know that she's really close to the entire bridge crew, like obviously looking at Deanna specifically. And she also does offer her counseling services to the entire bridge crew, including Captain Picard. So I could totally see how that could be a little bit complicated and you have those various conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could totally see that being a case. Well, that being said, in real life, do people that know you or are friends with you ever ask you for counseling advice? Like, do they ever come to you with those kind of questions? Or do you kind of say like, no, I'm drawing the line here. This is the line. Like, do you say that? Or do you actually offer any sort of insight?
Well, first of all, I'm not an asshole. Like if a friend's coming to me for help, I'm not going to say, go away.
Wow.
But typically when friends come to me, I always say to them, like, hey, I'm going to talk to you as a friend and just kind of listen to you and do what I can for you. And so I think that's an important line for me to draw with them. And as I talk with them, if it's kind of like a normal, everyday kind of stressors and stuff, it's just like, yeah, we'll just kind of chat, have a drink together. But if it starts to sound like something very serious, then I'll kind of talk to them about it and then express to them why I think it's serious and then help them find a therapist in their local area.
Got it. So if we were trying to reflect real life, Deanna would be actually giving referrals to people to talk to other counselors or other therapists versus actually being the one to disseminate all this advice on her own.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how teletherapy would look like via subspace. I was like, what's the range of that?
I mean, it's basically almost all in real time, so like whatever. But I mean, let's be real, that's how Star Trek works. But I think that would have been interesting if she occasionally did say, actually, I'm not in a place to help you. I need to refer you to whoever on Mars. That would actually have been kind of interesting if that kind of reflected real life a little bit. Yeah.
And I also kind of think about, we talk about psychology and mental health, but we are being biased in the way we're talking about it. We're talking about it from a human-centered way of thinking about psychology. What would psychology look like and mental health look like for a Klingon or an Andorian?
Yeah.
What would it look like for a Vulcan? What does it look like for a Romulus? Like there's so many different dimensions of that. And are there analogous professions? Are there analogous roles on those worlds in which they do those things? And then if there are, the question is, does Deanna just study the psychology of Klingons and Vulcans and Andorians and other aliens out there and then kind of coalesce it into her profession? Or does she refer out? It's like, you're going through something. I would recommend that you speak to the counselor on Quonos or something.
Right. No, that's a good point. I do think that Deanna, she has mentioned that she studied other cultures, like that episode where Worf backbroke ethics and Worf wanted Riker to basically help him perform ritual suicide. Deanna did in that episode have like she talked to Riker because Will was like all fired up about it. And then I think Deanna was the one that helped him to process it and was like, no, you don't understand. He's asking you because like you're his best friend or something. And for him, it's a matter of honor, yada, yada, yada. But to your point, I do think that this is one of my biggest critiques about Star Trek. I do think that it takes a very humanist approach to everything. It is Mike and I were just talking about Star Trek 6 on Undiscovered Country last week, where sometimes the Federation does really seem like a Homo sapiens only club, where everything's about humanity. When I think the opportunity sometimes in Star Trek is to celebrate and investigate that diversity, particularly when it comes to interspecies relationships. And that's something that, I feel like we don't really get to see enough of that perspective from other species and what it means to not be human. versus like, oh, everybody's kind of human, which is very Star Trek, I think.
And again, I'm going to be critical of that. But before I become critical, I do want to say, because there are so many alien races within Star Trek, even in like the original series, Next Generation, and Voyager, it did bring light to, wait a second, people are different. They are different depending on where they're coming from, their culture, as well as their traditions. However, I think there's an aspect of Star Trek that goes into not just looking at, oh, all Klingons are like this, or all Vulcans are like this. And what that does is it simplifies a lot of different cultures. For example, to say that all Koreans are like this, or all people from France are like this, or all people from Mexico are like this, is a little too simplistic, especially since our planet is so globalized. Like, people from other countries are enjoying things from other countries. And people here are enjoying more foreign media, such as Squid Game and Kingdom and all these other things that are coming in. And so, I kind of wished Star Trek had leaned into that a little bit more, if that culture piece was something that's important, like leaned into more of what was it like for Worf to grow up with human parents? And what was it like for Worf to grow up in that human world, and look more into that struggle between maintaining his Klingon identity while also maintaining his human identity. Like, I would have loved to see Worf celebrate Christmas. Because he grew up with humans as a kid. Right. It's like, why didn't we see him celebrate and honor things from his human culture? And all we see is that he is a almost exaggeration of the Klingon culture.
Yeah. I think that is an interesting point. And I think that sometimes that also translates to how limiting the portrayal of certain cultures within, like you're saying, on one planet might look like. On, like, for example, we have a lot of humans, but for example, Harry Kim, who is Garrett Wang, is Chinese, but he was portraying a Korean character. We don't ever talk. We hear him talk a lot about his parents and how he wants to go home, but we never hear him say anything about his Korean culture, or hear him say anything in Korean or anything along those lines. He's basically just another member of the crew that is very similar to everyone else. And there really isn't that examination of cultural diversity within one race, because I don't see why, even in a few hundred years, that would disappear. Like, even if we were kind of united under one banner and one government, it doesn't necessarily mean that our cultural differences would just suddenly homogenize. So I do think that, other than Picard occasionally going to his vineyard and being like, France, like, it's like, there's so much missed opportunity when it comes to how complex some of these characters could be, not only celebrating their cultures, but then how they think about things and how that impacts their headspace and their mindset, and ultimately how that also impacts how they see other cultures too. So I do think that's kind of a missed opportunity that we don't tend to see that much in Star Trek.
And it is a big missed opportunity, but at the same time, I appreciate Star Trek to have laid the foundation so we can have a conversation about this. Like, there are enough foundational pieces within the episodes for us to talk about these more complicated aspects of different cultures and where people are coming from.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah, I think that it would also be interesting for us to talk a little bit more about just like specific use cases in Star Trek, and how we can potentially look at some specific instances where we see people struggling with mental health, and how we can look at how realistic that was portrayed, how that was approached in Star Trek versus how we should be approaching in real life, and kind of recognizing that. And one of the examples that we had talked about prior to recording was looking at one of our favorite / notorious characters, Reginald Barclay, who definitely has some issues. And when he was introduced in The Next Generation, he was basically portrayed as this bumbling idiot, very socially awkward, and he was essentially addicted to the holodeck. And he he would basically live out his fantasies. He would basically live out the way that he wanted to live life in the holodeck. And yeah, just thought that it would be interesting. And for me, Barclay is kind of a triggering character because he's so awkward. And I used to be really awkward. Not that I'm never awkward now, but I used to be like really awkward. So when I see Barclay and his social awkwardness, I'm like, oh my God, I'm like triggered.
So about that episode, I just watched that today. And
which one, the TNG one or the Voyager one?
Okay. No, the TNG one. So Hollow Pursuits is a cringe-worthy episode, I think, in today's context. Because for me, watching it, one, there's a whole like management perspective of this and how they're talking, how Riker kind of says some things that come off very angry and frustrated in the midst of, the bridge or in front of other characters, which bothered me, number one. But number two, it's clear that, watching it now, you can tell that we would probably say that Barclay is on the autism spectrum. And so there was obviously that wasn't a term back then when they recorded that they used, but just the lack of sensitivity around it and the fact that Geordi had to be basically commanded to be his best friend and told to make it work, which I think is actually really good advice from Picard as an overall leader. But yeah, I was watching that and I was like, wow, this is an episode that does not age well. And I would say that I would not recommend this be shown to any new kind of Star Trek watcher, because this is actually sort of like we say about TOS episodes all the time, how cringeworthy they are because of the treatment of women. I think that this is, this particular episode is a cringeworthy episode of treatment of, someone who has autism or is on the spectrum. And, it just didn't vibe with my understanding of the Federation and or Starfleet and or humanity in the 24th century. So I thought that was actually a really, I was like having all kinds of like negative feelings, like Johnson watching a TOS episode.
Oh yeah, I go on and on about TOS episodes.
So I think that it's kind of looking back on it now, again, we need to watch TV in the context of when it was produced, not that all TV is timeless, because it's really not. I mean, you can't go back and watch like Mary Tyler Moore or the Jeffersons or any of those kind of television shows and put them in context of today's world, because it just doesn't work that way. But that was really surprising.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point of looking at what television looked like at the time and what it looks like now, because there's been a huge shift, at least what I've noticed, of it being initially entertaining. That's what television was, is entertaining with caricatures, exaggerated forms of people you'd see in life. And now we're slowly moving to more realistic versions of people and people that we can more relate to and understand. And I think one of the things with Barclay is when he was initially introduced, I think it's possible that the writers were thinking about autism. And if they were, I think they should have brought in a few more elements to it in order to make that fit. But kind of seeing the evolution of that character and the way that it was written, I would say I would personally, and not that I can diagnose a fictional character that's on a TV show who's not a client, but I would say it's more somewhere in the realm of an anxiety disorder. And the reason I say that is if you have autism, you have autism everywhere. And he didn't have it on the holodeck when he was interacting with the Voyager, the holographic Voyager crew. Like, he was fine with his social interactions. And then we see an Endgame later in the future, he's fine with his interactions until there's a stressful situation where he has to lie about where Janeway's going. And then we see the stuttering coming back out. We see some of his ways of coping with that anxiety come out again. So I don't know what was going on in the brain of the writers at the time, but that's kind of the feel that I got from it.
Right. And what are your thoughts about the whole, a common through line in his story arc is his addiction to the holodeck, and that would be his space to be quote unquote himself, or a more idealized version of himself. What do you think in terms of how the writers contextualized him being quote unquote addicted to the holodeck? Like, do you feel that was legitimately an addiction? Do you feel is more like, because sometimes fantasies are helpful, fantasies allow us to kind of, release stress. There are definitely a lot of mental health benefits to fantasizing, both in real life and then also in a situation like the holodeck or whatever. What do you think about that? And how do you think the writers approached it?
Well, initially, I'll say my first gut reaction was, oh, this is bad. But that's what the writers wanted me to feel as an audience member watching the show. It's like, oh my gosh, this is bad. He shouldn't be doing this. But reflecting on it and kind of thinking about it, my question is like, is it really that bad? And the way I come at this, and a lot of people come to me, it's like, oh my gosh, am I an addict? Am I addicted to this? Am I an alcoholic and such? And they always, the question I always get is, how much do I have to consume of whatever it is in order to be an addict and to be okay? And I say it's not really about the amount. It's really about what sort of dysfunction is being created in your life. So if you enjoy a nightcap on most nights, but you do everything you need to do and there's no dysfunction in your life, your finances are fine, you're going to work, you're going to social events. If you miss a drink, it's not that big a deal. But if you're telling me you're missing work, you're skipping out on social things, like your health was going out the wazoo, then it's like, okay, I think we have a problem here. And now if we take that lens of dysfunction being created or not created, and look at Barclay with the hologram and the holodeck and going into the holodeck, he was having trouble sleeping. He was having insomnia, but he could sleep in the holographic version of his quarters on Voyager. Don't we want good sleep? Like, I don't know about you. If I don't get good sleep, I am cranky forever. And so part of me is like, well, that's kind of a good thing. He's getting the sleep that he needs. And on top of that, he wasn't in there just to make himself feel better. I mean, there were some instances of that and some like pseudo socialization stuff, but we do see instances of him in that holodeck solving problems. Like he's actually working out things, talking with B'Elanna, talking with Chakotay and Janeway and Seven, and working through some of these issues and problems. And it wasn't portrayed in the episodes because I think the writers really wanted to show this as a problem. But I wonder if this was set in a more real life scenario, if he was actually making progress in his job. Now, granted, the writers made it so that he wasn't making progress. So his boss was really concerned and checking in on him and said, hey, I really want you to take a break. Why don't you come over to, our home and, have dinner with us and, get to know us better. And he missed out on that. That part concerned me. And I think that was a good show on the writer's part to show like, okay, this is an addiction because he is demonstrating dysfunction. But I also kind of had this other end of it. It's like, okay, if this was a real life scenario, would there be dysfunction? Like, would he have skipped out in having that dinner with his boss or not?
Right. And I think that's really interesting because, again, to what you're saying, the writers are, especially in Hollow Pursuits, the original TNG episode, they like you're saying, they want to make us feel something, and they want very clearly for us to feel that this is wrong and that this is not good. But once you start to break it down and you try to it's like sometimes Star Trek can be a little heavy-handed, right? Like it's not necessarily the most nuanced show with a lot of gray area. Like that's not all Star Trek, but sometimes it is very heavy-handed. And I think this is a case where there's probably more gray area to potentially explore and talk about. Because in that original TNG episode, it happens a little bit less in the Voyager episode, but in the original TNG episode, basically the bridge officers go in, they like see that Barclay is running this fantasy program, and their initial reaction is to shut it all down. They're like, delete these characters and shut down the program. And obviously that's part of that is the writers telling us how to react. But I would just love to know, like in a real life situation, say, obviously we don't have a holodeck, but, say if it is this situation where you are talking to someone who is kind of maybe skirting the edge of addiction because they are functional, but they're probably relying a little bit too much on something. How should we be, like, obviously we're not going to just shut it down cold turkey. I don't think that's necessarily the way to go, but what would the proper way be to recognize and to gauge whether or not there is a problem and then to actually properly intervene?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we can jump off of kind of what was happening in that episode. It's you got to get to know the person. It's not so much. I'm reminded of the words of G.K. Chesterton, has nothing to do with Star Trek, who said, "Don't ever take a fence down without knowing why it was put up in the first place." And so you don't ever want to just whip up something or say stop it completely or like get rid of something without understanding why it was put there. So if someone, let's say, is drinking a little too much or they're, engaging in drugs a little too much and it's causing dysfunction in their life and I'm working with them, my first thought isn't, oh my gosh, I need to get you to stop doing it. It's what's pushing you to do this? Like what's pushing you to this point so that this is the only thing that you can do. And once we get an understanding of that, then we can kind of start talking about, okay, is this a situation where we want to tackle that problem that's getting this person to this point? Or is this a situation where we want to find other kinds of coping mechanisms? Like, for instance, I'm going to go back to the Voyager episode.
Sure,
I don't know why that's so salient in my mind right now.
Yeah, you love Voyager. We get it.
Yeah. The sleeping, like he couldn't sleep, but he could sleep on that holodeck simulation of his Voyager quarters. I think I would say if I was seeing him as a client for his insomnia, I would tell him like, okay, sleep in the Voyager quarters for a week. Like we'll get permission. That's where you're going to sleep for this week. Next week he comes in, he's fully rested, he's getting good sleep. I would say, okay, now let's try every other day this week. And let's try to replicate the same pillows and blankets that they use in the Voyager starship and replace yours with that. And then I'm sure there are ways to like change the walls and stuff too, like replicate new walls and new lights or whatever. Sure. And slowly move that back into the real life. And I mean, if he likes sleeping with his Voyager blankets, who cares? It's like, let him sleep with his Voyager blankets. I mean, I kind of want to try the Voyager blankets. I wonder if they're comfortable.
I think they look kind of itchy, but to each their own. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think that, I love what you said. Like just the first step is actually getting to know the person, because I think we all have a tendency to judge before we really try to get to know. I think that's very natural for us. I know for me that, sometimes I jump to conclusions before really getting to know someone. So I think that's really, really helpful advice that we all should.
And doesn't Star Trek teach us to not judge people?
Of course.
As soon as we meet them, oh my gosh, your listeners are going to crucify me. What's that episode where they only speak in metaphors?
Oh, Darmok.
Darmok, yes. It's like that's clearly an episode where we shouldn't judge someone just based on what we see and hear.
Yeah.
Talking about some other instances in Star Trek, like where else have you seen great examples of mental health portrayals or issues? For instance, like I know you're more of a Voyager than a DS9 fan, but if you haven't going back and seeing the evolution of Nog as a character in Deep Space Nine, and how he loses his leg, and that whole progression is really, for me, I can see that that being a great example of a mental health portrayal. But more recently, one of our, we mentioned him before, I think before we recorded, but Wilson Cruz, specifically in the beginning of season 3 or throughout season 3 of Discovery, was really trying to help that crew get through the trauma of leaving everything that they know behind and only having themselves to rely on as their family and their support system, and how he starts to I was going to say minister to, but more appropriately, like act as a counselor to the crew. Do you have any thoughts on his on that portrayal or any other portrayal in more modern Star Trek?
So I will say, what I will say is specifically your example of Nog from Deep Space Nine is one of the first examples that I remember where it was, oh, there is some sort of, trauma or something that's carried through. It's not just neatly tied up and within a 45-minute episode. It's like, oh, I had this happen. I get angry for a few minutes, and then it's all better because X happened. And I think that was one of the first times where that really occurred, because we're going to go back to Voyager again. I just kept thinking, it's like,
all goes back to Voyager.
You just got launched to another quadrant on the other side of the galaxy. There's got to be pissed off people because of that. People who've lost their families, and you only saw, and I could be wrong, and I'm sure there's an example of like 1 or 2 people, but it was only in the Maquis that expressed any discontent with that. It seemed like all the Starfleet crew were completely fine with it. I was just like, yeah, I don't care if I was part of Starfleet. I would be pissed off about that. I'd be like reeling about this. And then when
and Harry Kim sort of represented that,
a little,
as much as possible back then in that kind of storytelling environment.
He was like, I miss my parents. That was it. It was like, I miss parents.
It was just like, oh, I miss home and I wish I was there. It was more of like you pitiful little thing. Or I'm also from Georgia, so I said, oh, bless your little heart. But
wait, is Harry Kim from Georgia?
No, I am.
Oh, okay. I was like, I completely lost the analogy. Okay, continue.
I wonder if there will be a George. Anyways, but in the more recent Star Trek series like Picard and Discovery, which I know are Johnson's favorite series.
Oh my God, don't get me started.
Please don't.
Let's keep on going. Let's keep on going.
No, yes. Just I'm gonna mute Johnson right now, and we can continue on with this discussion.
Keep on going.
But I really appreciated how they are portraying that struggle they're going through. Like, this was not an easy choice for them to make, even jumping to the future or the stuff they're handling. And for Johnson's sake, I'll jump to saying in Strange New Worlds with Captain Pike, and that reoccurring image of his death and how that happens, and how it's not the focus of every single episode, but there's some sort of allusion to it in just about every episode. Like, it's kind of like it's hiding in the back of his head. And I like that, because trauma doesn't always mean that it rules and dominates every single part of someone's life. It varies. Some people have gone through very traumatic experiences, and it's not something that they carry with all the time. And there's certain things that may trigger them to kind of relive certain aspects of it. One of the things that happened to me is I studied abroad when I was in university in 2004, I believe. And I went to London at the time that summer, and it was a great experience. But one day I do remember I was sitting in a classroom. We were getting ready to meet our professors, and I heard this loud bang. Essentially, I was there during the bombings. And so I was across the street from the bus that had exploded, the remote bomb. And then there were 2 more explosions that had happened in their subways. And so we thought our professors were dead, because that was a subway that they would have taken that morning to meet us. They were fine. All the trains stopped, of course. And so they had to walk the entire way. And so it took them a long time to get to us. But it wasn't something that was always on the forefront of my mind when I came back. As a matter of fact, I didn't really think about it. I just kind of talked about it, told people what happened. And then I was sitting in church one day, and that Sunday, the pastor was doing some sort of sermon illustration and took out a balloon and popped it. And I could not explain why, but I just broke down sobbing uncontrollably in that moment. And the best thing I could say, and I don't really have clear memories of it, is like, I think I was reminded of my mortality at that moment and realizing how close I was to death. Because I could have just as easily been outside when that bus exploded. And it's not something that rules my life. It's not something that dominates all of my thoughts. It's just something I'll think about every now and then. And that's something I like about the portrayal of Captain Pike's traumatic experience of seeing his future. It's like it's not always on the forefront. And we also have examples of where that is on the forefront. That is something that is driving people. Like, I can't remember the character's name in Discovery. His planet Quajon was destroyed. Book, yes. And like how all of his decisions are really based around the loss of his people. Or even in the J.J. Abrams movies, Spock seeing Vulcan being destroyed. And we're seeing that trauma manifesting. It's like, yes, there are the big ones, as well as these that just kind of fester in the back of our heads.
Yeah, I love that. Are there any specific like sci-fi tools like that have been portrayed in Star Trek to kind of deal with that trauma? Obviously, we have mind melds, we have telepathy, we have holodecks. Do you think that there have been any that have been particularly effective in the series of deal with trauma? Like one of my favorites, I actually really dislike Vic Fontaine, the DS9 holographic character. I hate Vic Fontaine. I complain about Vic Fontaine endlessly as well. But one of my favorite episodes of DS9 is that follow-up to Nog losing his leg, where it's not an addiction, but he can't leave the holodeck. He goes in the holodeck, he goes into Vic's casino, and he can't leave because he feels comfort there. He starts to just live there. Ezri tries to come and get him out. And he's like, no, you can't force me to leave. If you force me to leave, I'm going to resign. So they're like, okay, all right, we got to give him more time. And then Vic is finally the one that helps Nog to realize that he's just afraid, that he can't face the real world. He can't go out because he's afraid of dying. And it takes him living in the holodeck, very similar to Barclay, but different. But it takes him living in the holodeck for weeks for him to come to that conclusion. And eventually he's able to bring himself out of the holodeck and kind of go back to quote unquote the real world. But are there any other sci-fi scenarios that you think have been particularly effective at whether it's an allusion to or a metaphor for how we need to address or treat trauma when we do see it?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I really appreciate that brief summary of that DS9 episode because I'm now remembering. It's like, oh yeah, that was one of my favorite episodes that
really
I really liked. And going back to your earlier question of what can non-mental health professionals, everyday folks who have a friend that are going through something like addiction or a really tough time, what can they do? And I'll say, be like Vic Fontaine, like be willing to help someone, just be there for them. It's not your job as a human being to come up with the right phrase or like the insightful words that will cause a life change in the person. It's for you to just be there. And that's what Vic Fontaine did.
Right.
And by allowing Nog to live with Vic Fontaine and getting to know him, Vic was watching him and observing him and seeing what was going on. He was learning the context of Nog's psyche in a way that his other friends weren't. And so Vic was able to see and get to know Nog, not just his history and who he was, but also who Nog was at the time and when he was going through that. And because he saw all that, because he built that relationship with Nog, Nog was really ready to listen to what Vic had to say when Vic was, giving him some hard truths at the time. Right. And Nog knew that those words were not coming from a place of criticism and judgment, but he knew it was coming from a place of care, because he saw how Vic was caring for him. He understood Vic was caring, and wanting him to be better. And so I think that's something that, everyday folks can do, is just be there for one another.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's really great to hear.
Well, how about I take it in this direction? There was one more thing I want to kind of talk about.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Therapy does not look like how it's portrayed in Star Trek. Like, I'm just going to start there.
Yeah,
sure.
I would, if I were just to take a wild guess, and if you happen to have listeners out there who were writers on some of these shows and stuff,
I would love to imagine that all the writers of Star Trek listen to our podcast. Mike would love it, but I don't know if that's the case. I feel like we have like 3 listeners. But
if I were to take a wild guess, I would say that some of those writers had been through therapy before. Like, they had seen a counselor or a therapist. And because they had been with them for so long, they probably remember like the big insightful moments, like the moments where they had certain breakthroughs, or like, oh yeah, that's right, I'm living life like this. And that is really hard to translate into 3 minutes in an episode.
Right.
And that's kind of what I see especially when I look at TNG and the examples that they have of therapy there.
Yeah.
And so what I want to portray and express to your listeners out there is, do not expect therapy to be a place where someone like me is going to dispense this sagacious wisdom to you that's going to change your life within 3 minutes. It's like, that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is the first 2 sessions is you as the client are going to be talking for almost the entire time. And the reason for that, and what I tell my students when I teach counseling, is a lot of these people who come to see you, a lot of these clients have already talked to friends, they've already talked to family, and they've had many examples of regular folks who just listened to like a few seconds of their problem and said, oh, you just need to do this, or you just need to do that, or this is what you need to do. And most of the time that doesn't work. And so for us to avoid that, we need to listen and get as full of a context of the situation as possible. And so, yeah, first 2-3 sessions might just be you talking a lot. But then afterwards, that's when the clinician is able to really dive in with you to really explore, okay, what are some different areas that we can go? I
think that's really important. Yeah. I think that's really important because, people will often walk away from therapy early on because they don't have those miraculous insights that they kind of expect from therapy right off the get-go. And so, I've heard this from multiple people, that all they did was sit there and talk, and that was it, so it's, it's kind of, it gets frustrating for them because they're going in there looking for a solution, and they're not getting the solution quite as fast as they would normally, or what they've maybe seen on television, whether it be Star Trek, which, most of the people that I've talked to are not pulling that from Star Trek, but they're pulling it from whatever movies or contexts that they see. I would bet that half of those people, or a lot of people, get their context from like these 2-hour rom-coms where they are in therapy, and suddenly by the end of the 2 hours, their life is all wonderful, rainbows and unicorns, as we like to say here on Deep Space Pride. So
yes, say it all the
time. It's Johnson's favorite thing to say, definitely. Rainbows and unicorns. So I think that that maybe that's an opportunity for Star Trek in general to show something over the long term that the payoff is not, and also maybe to have scenes where that person is expressing the frustration of, all I did was talk for 50 minutes. They didn't say, the therapist didn't say anything, and kind of offer that perspective. I think that Sam, that is the most valuable thing that I mean, we've talked a lot about it, but if, that would be the audio clip that I would want people to like latch on to is that piece right there, that there is no like snap,
right,
easy fix for it, but also like it's a process. Like it's a process of the clinician listening to the client for, several sessions, like you said.
Yeah. And despite the fact that I really disliked Discovery season 4, I appreciate
you didn't like season 4, really?
Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
I'm shocked.
Whatever. You didn't like season 4 that much either, Mike.
I know. I'm kidding.
Shut the F up.
I'm just messing.
Shut up. Okay. In any case, one thing I did appreciate about season 4, and I think it was like frustrating, but it was also realistic. Books like the process of him grieving in his journey. It was very much, and I think it was frustrating because it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And there were many instances of that through the entire season. And you saw people around him, including Michael, get frustrated with him, not understand why he was so angry or why he can let go of his anger. And even after there were moments when he seemed to make a breakthrough or there was clarity, he would go back to some funk or, being really just kind of dwelling in his anger. And I did think that was realistic. I did appreciate that because oftentimes I think that's probably real life. Like you feel like you make a breakthrough and you actually, and then the next day you're like, but why don't I feel catharsis? Why don't I feel better? Because it is a process and it takes a while, and everyone's journey is different. So I do think that was a great portrayal of grief and anger and him having to work through things. And obviously there are these like all sci-fi elements that are happening, including like mind melds and such. But we do see him grapple with that and wrestle with it. And we also see how the people around him, such as Michael or even President Tarina or Culber, are affected by it. And I did appreciate that journey. And to me, as a viewer, it was a little frustrating. But I think that it would also be frustrating, to be honest, in real life. Like, like maybe watching someone that you love having to grapple with grief or trauma and just seeing that it's taking them longer than you would like, but no one can dictate the timeline.
I mean, that's the most positive thing you've ever said about
Absolutely.
Discovery ever.
Yes.
But yes. I also think that what was lacking in that season though was more discussion around that. And more because what you just said kind of clarified a lot of season 4 for me, where I was getting frustrated. I was probably that person who was getting frustrated with the fact that book is not changing, when what you just explained was it is a process, which I know, but for me that sort of helped me out in understanding it just now from what you said. But I think that there was an opportunity to make that a little more obvious and maybe a little less of a centerpiece of the entire season. Maybe, that's just, again, there are many issues with season 4 of Discovery. That being one of them. But for me, I think you just helped clarify some of my own frustration with that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.
Yeah. That was a great summation of Book's trauma through season 4.
Yeah, it really was. I just wish it wasn't so much of a focus. I mean,
All right. Well, Dr. Sam, thank you so much for just all your insight. We love that you're a Star Trek fan and that you're able to take that fandom and just see it through your lens as a professional. Do you have any parting words for our listeners? Anything that you want to leave them with?
Wow, no pressure, right?
No pressure, though. No pressure.
I really like our discussion and talking about what therapy looks like. And the only thing I would add to that is just be there for one another. There's so much research to show that social supports, so your friend groups, your family, and I would guess like even the Star Trek fandom, like there's a kind of like a small kind of like family kind of feel to that. Supporting one another through that will make you and a lot of other people very resilient to the stressors of this world. And last time I checked and read the news, there's plenty of stressors in this world,
just a few
for us to be stressed about. So be there for one another and try to be a united federation with one another. And then the last thing I would say is I would give my left arm to people to do a mind meld. That would make my job so much easier.
Oh my God, you would make millions. Maybe not millions, but you'd make a lot of money.
But then you would have all that junk in your head. You'd have to you'd have.
But then you compartmentalize it like a Vulcan. Just make boxes and like lock them up.
What do you? I think for someone who might be listening to this and is like, I think I might need some therapy, some counseling. What kind of resources do you point people to if they're living outside of the states that you're kind of a licensed therapist in?
Sure thing. Even in the licenses, or even in the states that I do have my license, I would encourage people to look up some directories like Psychology Today. There's plenty of people there. One of the first places I tell people to go to is check their insurance and call up their insurance and ask, like, do you cover are there mental health benefits that are covered? And then they're usually linked with certain professionals. Additionally, if you work for a company, there's often employee assistance programs that provide certain amounts of free therapy. So check that out as another resource. The other thing that I want to mention that's probably not talked about a lot is if you are a different culture or ethnicity than your therapist, that conversation is going to be a lot longer because there's going to be a lot more context that needs to be taken. And sometimes it's hard to find someone who overlaps with you. Like if I had a client who was into Star Trek, it'd be so much fun. We could use like Star Trek analogies to talk about them overcoming things with wonder and using that as a medium, which I think would be so fun. Probably could write a paper on that too, but that's a whole nother story. For Asian Americans, there's the Asian American Mental Health Network, I think is what it's called. And that's a directory of Asian American mental health therapists that are out there. And I'll send you the link for it so you can add that.
Yeah, we can add to the show notes.
And then lastly, the nonprofit organization that I work with is called mustardseedgeneration.org. And they have a directory of Korean American therapists in various states across the country. And each one of those therapists that are on the mustardseedgeneration.org website have been vetted. The organization has talked to these people, know who they are. They've checked their licenses, so they're good.
They're real, not holographic. Real psychologists,
Last time I
real
checked.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that cultural thing also extends obviously to the LGBTQ community, where finding a therapist who is in that spectrum of people would help in anyone's journey as well. Well, thanks so much, Sam, for joining us today, for being a part of this. Where can people go if they want to learn more about you and your podcast and your foundation?
I have a foundation.
Well, the nonprofit that you're involved with.
The nonprofit that you're
the nonprofit organization.
That'd be cool, though. You should start a foundation. Just do it.
I know, that'd be so cool. The nonprofit organization is mustardseedgeneration.org, of which I'm a board member, and they just do some really cool stuff. I have my own personal website, which is samuelykim.com, and you can find my podcast information there. I also have a few other things on there. I've been thinking about pulling my blog back up again, but apparently there's only 24 hours in a day. So that would be a place that people can find out more about me.
Unless you're in Bejor, and then there's 26 hours a day.
God.
So,
Nerd.
There you go.
The prophets have not blessed me.
Nor any of us. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Sam. Me. It's been a pleasure, and we really appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Thanks, Dr. Sam.
Thank you all.
All right. Well, that was another great episode, Mike. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about our sponsor?
Yes. So Fansets is the premier sponsor of Deep Space Pride and the Trek Geeks Podcast Network. And they are actually out with probably everyone who might be listening to this or might not be at formerly called Star Trek Las Vegas, now the 56-year mission. And if you go over to their table, say hi to them, tell them you heard you're a listener to either Deep Space Pride or any of the Trek Geeks podcasts. But go check out their pins. They have so many awesome pins, including they're going to have 100 sets of the memorial pin sets from Strange New Worlds there. They're also, they just released this, I think, yesterday, meaning Sunday. They posted a picture of the Next Generation badge that's going to join their Delta collection, which looks amazing. I believe they're possibly going to have a few at the convention.
Wait, is this just the Next Gen com badge?
Yeah, it's a new Delta to add to the collection. Yeah, they just announced it yesterday.
Wait, but don't they have the TNG one already? Or is there?
No, not the original. This is the season 1, 2, not the Voyager Deep Space Nine one.
Okay,
this is the original, like season 1 TNG com badge. Yes, so they've worked really hard. It's gone through many. Yeah, no problem. They've had many iterations. They've been working really hard on it, and it looks gorgeous. So go on over to their booth. I don't know when it's going to be up on fansets.com, but you can also keep checking there. They're also going to have the Delta collection from Star Trek Strange New Worlds, including the Operations and Sciences badges, which are going to come out in late September and October. So go and check all of those out. Tell them we sent you there. If not, head over to fansets.com, put a bunch of pins into your cart. If you spend more than $30 in the US, you're going to get free shipping. And as a bonus, add the promo code TrekGeeks, all caps, all one word, and you're going to get 10% off your order. And we want to thank Fansets for supporting Deep Space Pride and the Trek Geeks podcast network.
Thanks, Fansets. All right, another great episode. For those of you that want to reach out to us, you can do so on email or on social media. You can reach us at deepspacepride@gmail.com, or you can DM us on Twitter and Instagram at deepspacepride. And one of us, probably Mike, will respond to you because I don't check those things. Cool. All right. Well, that's it for us for this episode. We're not going to be in Vegas. I don't really feel FOMO, so I'm fine. But
I'm feeling a little FOMO. Hanging out with the rest of the Trek Geeks family would have been cool. They're a cool bunch.
It would have been fun, but then it would also have been exhausting. But it would have been fun.
Yes, but such is life.
Such is life. Right.
It's all the trade-off. We'll probably be exhausted from our festivities in Boston.
Yes.
And
weddings,
you and everyone else in the car will get to sleep as I drive us back from Boston on
I can help
Sunday.
navigate.
I could read. No, I do not need to.
I don't need it out there, because I like being helpful.
Do you really?
Sometimes.
Well, yes. So we hope you're all having fun out in Vegas or wherever you are. You're going to be enjoying the premiere episode of Lower Decks.
Oh, right. That's this week.
Yes. So go check that out. Let us know what you think of the premiere episode. I think it's great. Johnson has yet to watch it. He's waiting like everyone else to see it. So definitely check that out. Let us know what you think. And we will see you back here next week to talk about that episode.
Bye, everyone.
Deep Space Pride is a production of Coconut Media Works. Executive producers Bill Smith and Dan Davidson. For more great Star Trek discussion, discover the other shows of the Trek Geeks podcast network at trekgeeks.com or find us in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
Coconut.